How about no free lunch? We have to pay for the indulgences of the last 8 years. That a continuation of our conversation in the last hour of The Perfect Metaphor to describe our current economic global meltdown. We didn't quite nail it. On the Nancy Skinner Show, we're going to continue to try and find that perfect metaphor. 866-991-9927. It's a free call. There's nothing free, no free lunch. We're certainly paying for it, but that's a free call to the Nancy Skinner Show. Hey, I read this article about how President Obama, he actually called from Air Force One or Marine One, one or the other, a New York Times reporter, because he felt like he blew this guy off. The guy had asked him a serious question about whether he was embracing socialism, and the president sort of dismissed it, like laughed at it, and then afterwards he called the guy from the plane and said, "You weren't serious about that, like social. You were joking, right? That all of a sudden you think I'm openly embracing socialism." And he was so astonished. He said, I can't even believe that the guy would think that. Look what we've inherited. And his comment was like something, do you think I wanted this? Did you think I wanted to deal with all of these multiple problems at once? So, lots of discussion about what is this? What is these solutions? What are they? What is the nature of capitalism right now when it fails? So, I'm thinking about a lot of these heavy discussions. And thinking about the analogies going back to the great crash of 1929, a book by Kenneth Galbraith, a book which I read years and years ago. I think when I was in B school at U of M, but it is the classic book on my library to which I have been referring for years and years and years. Because it goes through how whenever you thought things were going to get worse, they just kept getting worse and worse. And that when you're getting, stock tips from taxi drivers and things like that, you knew that there was going to be a problem, and the analogy was so amazing. So imagine if your name is James Galbraith. It's like, your last name being like Gandhi or something. How could you ever live up to the eminent economist John Kenneth Galbraith, whose work is legendary? But he did. So James Galbraith, let's see, follows in his dad's footsteps, goes to Harvard and Yale. Okay. That's a good start. Works in Congress on the staff, many different staffs of congressmen, including the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, a guest scholar at the Brookings Institute, currently a director at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin, and a contributor to Mother Jones magazine with a new book called The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too, published last year, actually. That is probably right on the mark, predicting what we're going through this year. And I am so pleased to have James Galbraith with us now. Thank you so much, sir.
Nice to be with you.
Before I get into where we are and things that are going on, obviously there's got to be a little creepiness about the fact that your dad wrote this book that really we only knew so long. It was published in 1955, so it was historical in nature to go back and sort of recount that. But yet, you've probably been watching a slow run up to a repeat of events, the glut and the excess, the supply and demand, how those two factors have been too much supply, not enough demand, all those same kind of essentially contributing factors. You've probably been watching this in modern times.
Well, that book certainly is the all-time biggest seller in my father's very extensive list of publications. Mm-hmm. And he writes in there that the chances of a repeat of the Great Crash of '29 would go up as the generation which actually remembered it died off. He nailed. That's a comment which pretty well nailed the situation.
Right. Like the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which I talk so much about. I've been saying everyone, that was, this was a Depression era law, and that's essentially the argument they used to repeal it. It's too old. Well, it kind of was a result of we figured some things out and fixed it, right?
It only took, interestingly, just 10 years from the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 to the return of all of the problems, the huge collapse that that Glass-Steagall had been enacted to prevent.
Well, all right, before we get to, because I do want to we're back into all this discussion and all these economic terms being thrown around that I think are confusing most average people who don't follow this stuff as closely as we do. But do you want to explain what you call it, Steagall, whatever, the act is that provided the firewall so we wouldn't get back here again? You want to just give what you think is, James, what do you think is what is the most analogous situation to the Great Depression? We're talking about 29. Now everybody said it was 82. Everyone said we were closer to 82. Now people are kind of, they're out of the closet saying, okay, it's really more like 29. So what factors are most analogous?
The problem in 1929, a large part of the problem, was that commercial banks were taking people's money, deposits, ordinary deposits, and gambling with them on the stock market, in effect. The Glass-Steagall Act said, okay, there are now going to be two kinds of institutions. Commercial banks whose deposits will be insured and which will be regulated very heavily, and they're intended to be prudent and conservative institutions, and investment banks, which can take a lot more risk, but which don't have insurance. And so the idea was the investment banks fail, the commercial banks would not be affected. Breaking down that firewall between commercial and investment banks meant that the commercial banks were legally able and strongly encouraged to take much more risk. So when a guy like Robert Rubin was a senior advisor to Citigroup, that's what he told them. If you want to make more money, you have to accept more risk. And the result of that was, at the end of the day, they became vulnerable to the meltdown that occurred as a result of the profusion of extremely risky and, in fact, largely fraudulent and abusive assets, these securities that were based upon subprime mortgages.
So, in your book, The Predator State: How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too, I'm going to get a hold of this one, given how worn out the other one is. What you're saying is that you're talking about the predator state, that there's something that the rich have come to feast upon those who are not capable of really even handling this. What you're saying went on is that with subprime mortgages, with whatever credit default, was it anything goes thing that undermined the free market?
Well, my argument was that the free market was always a myth. From the New Deal forward, the major institutions of the economy were, in fact, public, very strong public institutions like Social Security, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that provided the secondary market for mortgages. One could go down a long list of, like the public universities. One could go down a long list of publicly supported parts of the economy. And what the conservative movement became was not an effort to destroy those institutions, but an effort to create a kind of diverted cash flow from them, an effort to take it off the top, to divert the payroll tax into the hands of brokers and through and fund managers through privatization, to subvert the standards that for prime mortgages that were then, basically you got a market which was largely taken over by these subprime mortgage originators, which were not regulated, and again, so on down the line, so that at the end of the day, in the financial sector, people basically lost trust. Banks lost trust in each other because they recognized that they had really poisoned the wells from which they were all drinking.
Right. And, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, this is the thing that I keep going back to. I mean, he says when you talk about economic theory here, there was perfect information. There are certain things implied in this, that perfect information, free-flowing, that's not the case, right? Certainly not the case.
Yeah, I'm not going to go and blame Adam Smith, who was a very sensible man, and no word of criticism of him has ever escaped my lips. But Adam Smith was dragooned into the service of a kind of a profoundly silly doctrines that made up the core of a kind of a modern economic model. And
like the Ricardo, so externalities. I talk about that all the time.
Right.
Other people don't understand that. Well, we should have no pollution because we just tax. What? And now they don't like market-based cap and trade, even though that would be like the perfect model. But what about the Ricardo? Explain that one. I love this myth. The free trade based on what's his name, Ricardo? It was wool and wine or something, and this little simple analogy about.
David Ricardo
Okay.
was a financier actually for the British Crown, and a self-taught economist who wrote a book called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in the early 19th century. And one of the chapters deals with foreign trade and makes an argument that you can always be more efficient by specializing in whatever you do relatively best. And it's a simple argument with a kind of very clear mathematics to it. And the problem with it is that, you could argue that it applies in a situation, this very limited context that Ricardo was thinking about. You really can't make it apply in a world where there is technical change, where there is limitations on the returns to scale, for example, in agriculture, where there are environmental limits, where there's learning, everything about the real world.
Like 6 billion people on the planet.
200 countries, 200 countries and thousands of products. It doesn't really work very well.
Right, yeah, and you can't make it the basis of the WTO, GATT, and every other thing.
That's a bit silly, yes.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happened, though, and that's what we're trying to explain. Now, I know that we only had you till 17. I don't know if you are able to come back for one more segment to tell us what you think needs to be done as a result. If not, we'll get you back another day. But if you can hold on, I would love to hear what you think the way out is.
I'll be happy to stay on for a few more minutes.
Okay, just a few more minutes would be perfect. Now that we've defined the problem with eminent economist in his own right, James Galbraith, who's at the University of Texas, great school, Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. We're going to get to the solutions and hear what he has to say. So that's going to be really cool. You're going to want to hear that. 866-991-9927 right here on The Nancy Skinner Show. All right, I want to jump right back in here. So we have a very special guest today. I'm very excited. For me, are you kidding me? How exciting this is to me, Miss. I'm not an economist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express Inn last night. Nancy Skinner Show, 866-991-9927. Our guest is James Galbraith. He is a professor at the University of Texas in Austin at the School of Public Affairs, the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and a contributing writer to Mother Jones magazine, son of John Kenneth Galbraith. So this whole idea of the situation we're in is something he knows well. So, James, when we left off, we wanted to talk about solutions. A lot of the same confluence of events are, I think, happening. I've been looking at this as a deflationary, kind of a long-running deflationary situation, despite some spikes in oil and whatnot occasionally. What do you think? We have the confluence of the credit crisis, that three-legged stool we were just talking about. You got housing crisis, you got a credit and banking crisis, and then you have a recessionary slowdown that is a result. And it's almost like a negative feedback loop with all three of these things. Any ideas?
Oh, absolutely, yes. My view is you have to break the feedback loop at the bottom of the pyramid. This is not a problem that's going to be solved, for example, by stuffing money into banks. It has to be solved by fixing the insecurity and the debt loads and the other sort of fundamental problems, the unemployment of American households. Which means that the government is going to have to and ought to be doing the same kinds of things that Roosevelt did in the early 1930s when he first of all, gave us deposit insurance, gave us Social Security, Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, and gave us Medicare. These things greatly improve the economic stability of the American population as a whole, and that translated into a much more stable basis for prosperity. So I would think in terms of expanding Social Security benefits. I would think in terms of decreasing the age of eligibility for Medicare, which would allow a lot of people who are working people who might have the resources to retire but don't want to do so because they're afraid of losing their health insurance to do that. I would think in terms of a major foreclosure relief program that would provide people the opportunity to stay in their homes on a sustainable basis, either by resetting their mortgages or converting them to rentals with the option to purchase. In other words, you need to approach this problem from the standpoint of what is good for the American
from the bottom up
as a whole, and not how to get the banking system to put more money into making loans to people who, frankly, don't want to borrow in this environment.
Right. It's the demand equation. One idea I put out there is, what about? I think the banking industry with their with the 30%. You're late one day and your rate goes up to 30%, and then people are so under debt that's the next thing that's going to have to be dealt with. What about reducing that? Just say, okay, the top marginal rate for that, like they do, anything else is 15%. Think of the liquidity that would enter into American households.
Well, I would say declare a holiday on the payroll tax. I mean, you can give every working family in the country an 8% odd pay increase, and that will help people pay their mortgages, pay their car loans, pay down their debts.
Okay, you know what? I am just plumb out of time, but I'm getting your book today, The Predator State, How Conservatives Abandon the Free Market and Why Liberals Should Too. James Galbraith, thank you so much for being with us today. It's illuminating and brilliant work. The Great Crash of 1929 was his dad's best work, and if you want to learn about what's going on, read that book again. Okay, we're going to get back to your calls, 866-991-9927 on The Nancy Skinner Show.